the Kiev government is a result of a coup orchestrated by the CIA, by the non-governmental organizations like Soros, and coordinated by Victoria Nuland, who was a leading operative under Dick Cheney, who is now a leading operative under Barack Obama.
Hey friends, thanks so much for joining us. We have back on the line our very dear friend Harley Schlanger from LarouchPAC. Harley, how are you?
I'm fine, Sean. Good to be with you.
Well, it's good to be with you. We don't need to do any fancy introductions for you, Harley, because everybody knows you as being one of the best historians that we speak with on a regular basis and a very knowledgeable person about what's going on in Europe. Harley, on this call today, we're going to talk about Greece and how the bailouts are an absolute fraud. But first, we need to talk about the Ukraine. You and I and Helga Zepp LaRouche did a call about Ukraine being a trigger for thermonuclear war back almost a year ago now, and that situation seems to only get worse. Now, what I want to ask you about, Harley, is this assassination of Boris Nemtsov. Immediately, almost immediately, Harley, world attention has been focused on this possibly being a CIA hit and that the CIA is out of control. There's video of the moment that Nemtsov was assassinated. There's a utility truck that slows down. It appears that the assassin got out of the utility truck, murdered Nemtsov, and then got in a getaway car. This is very, very diabolical stuff, Harley. What are your thoughts, Harley, on the current situation in Ukraine? And let's start with the Nemtsov murder.
Well, of course, the media in the West is saying that it was Putin who did it and Putin's going to cover it up. And this is just more of the same lying that fits the narrative of the administration and both parties. Because when I'm talking now about the Ukraine policy, I'm not just talking about Obama, who's absolutely crazy on this. He's really pushing us into a situation of nuclear war, but also John McCain and Republicans who want to arm Kiev when they know full well that the Kiev government is a result of a coup orchestrated by the CIA, by the non-governmental organizations like Soros, and coordinated by Victoria Nuland, who was a leading operative under Dick Cheney, who is now a leading operative under Barack Obama. So there's a unanimity at the top, and the narrative in the mainstream media is, not surprisingly, Putin, Putin, Putin. He did it, he's aggressive, and we've got to stop him. Now, Putin would have to be a fool to carry out an assassination of Nemtsov, who's actually not that important. Nemtsov's opposition is a tiny, tiny portion of the Russian population. Putin's poll figures are in the upper 80%.
Right.
Because the Russian people see him as defending their nation against a potential US NATO attack. And so the first thing that should just be realized is that this is the typical kind of false flag operation that we've seen over and over and over again. Now, it comes at a point where the momentum for a war over Ukraine is being lost for two reasons. One, the Ukrainian government is a failed government, just like Libya after Gaddafi, just like Iraq after Saddam. We destroy these countries, and then we put in a caretaker government to act on behalf of the bankers and the establishment, the Western transatlantic financial establishment. And the Ukrainian government is bleeding Ukraine to death to pay off debt. At the same time, their army won't fight. 60% of the casualties in the Ukrainian army, according to a report that was in the German media, are from friendly fire. They don't want to go to war. And so the Minsk agreement, where the Europeans finally said, look, they didn't want to go to war over Ukraine. They sat down with Putin. It was a very difficult negotiation, but they got an agreement to pull back from war. And this is what Putin wants. He doesn't want a war in Ukraine. Now, meanwhile, the narrative in the West is there are Russian tanks, Russian fighters. Putin is trying to take over Ukraine. He's targeting the Baltic countries. And this is coming from people such as the Breedlove of NATO, the U.S. commander of NATO forces, the British commander of NATO forces, who are all saying that we've got to build up our forces there. But more importantly, and this is something that there's an article by a man named Theodore Postel, which is a very important article. He was a negotiator for Reagan on arms control. He negotiated with the Russians. And Postel warned that the upgrading of our tactical nuclear forces in Europe, combined with the cyber warfare that we think will work to disarm Russia, is leading us to a dangerous situation which could be a nuclear war. And he said that we should be involved in negotiations and diplomacy with Ukraine, but under no circumstance should we be modernizing our nuclear forces in Europe. The Germans don't want those forces modernized. They're talking about upgrading our tactical nuclear weapons to have longer range and more precise targeting. Now, why? Are we really on the verge of war with Russia? Are our interests and Russia's interests so divergent? No, not the American people's interests, but the interests of the global financial elite, the banksters, are out to destroy Russia because Russia is one pole of opposition to this global bankers' dictatorship. And that's why we're on the verge of war. Not anything Russia's doing or Putin's doing, but the fact that Obama is a bought and paid agent of this global bankers' dictatorship, working with the British and working with NATO, with the idea that they can bluff Russia with the threat of limited nuclear war into surrendering their sovereignty. And it's not going to work.
You mentioned the banksters. I'm nodding in agreement. One thing that needs to be said, Harley, and I'm sure you'd agree, is that almost regardless of who's in the White House, with the exception of a Ron Paul, perhaps a Rand Paul, I don't think things are going to change. And in fact, in this country, they're shoving Jeb Bush down our throats as the quote-unquote front runner, which is absolute nonsense. In his latest appearance at CPAC, he had to bus in supporters because he has no supporters. There's no grassroots support for this man, just like there's no real support for a criminal like Hillary. If Obama is no longer in office in 2016, I say if, nothing will change in Ukraine, will it? Because it doesn't matter who's in office. These insane Ukrainian policies, these insane NATO policies, this insane policy of surrounding Putin and forcing us almost into a thermonuclear exchange with Putin, these policies aren't going to change, are they, Harley?
Well, the people who are running the transatlantic financial system have no choice. Their system is bankrupt. We see that because of what's happening in Greece. We also see that in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. They're doing a big bailout of Ukraine, which is a waste of money. Ukraine's never going to be able to pay the debt back. They're less creditworthy than Greece was. So they're doing everything they can to hold their system together. And one of the things they're doing is they're using this narrative process of there's no alternative but to go to war in the Middle East, to go to war against Russia, to bail out the banks, to basically convince people there's nothing you can do. And then they throw them the red meat of hot button issues. So people get all worked up about immigration or the Keystone Pipeline or abortion, when in fact we're on the verge of a thermonuclear war. So the central question here, if you want change, don't count on any of these politicians. The change has to come from the American people. And we have to stop being suckers for local issues or small issues and get at the bigger questions. Number one, the bankruptcy of the financial system. And we at LarouchPAC, as you know, have a whole series of policies that would reverse that. And secondly, understanding who our real enemy is in the world. And it's not Russia or China, it's the international bankers. And if Americans woke up to that, and there have been plenty of people talking about it, but I think now more and more people are beginning to see there's no solution within the current framework. We've got to have a mobilization to get Obama out of office on the right issues, his violation of the Constitution, and to throw out Boehner as well, and clean out people like that Nazi Victoria Nuland in the State Department. If the American people rose up and did that, it would completely throw all the calculations for 2016 out the window. And I agree with you exactly. They are trying to get a Bush-Hillary election, which would be not just a repeat of the past, but it would be an attempt to keep the American people passive, demoralized, and out of the equation.
Harley, do you ever begin to feel, as I do, though, that the banking powers are so aligned against humanity at this point, and that their powers are so interwoven and so widespread globally, that there really is no way to throw off this monster that is strangling humanity? I want to believe there's a way to do it. I want to believe that we can just wake up our friends, neighbors, and colleagues, that the American people will come to their senses, and that we can throw this beast off. But what's the reality, Harley? Can we do it? Is it possible? I mean, does this system just need to collapse under its own weight for that to happen?
Well, it is possible. And the reason is because they are technically bankrupt. And the problem is getting sovereign governments to function as sovereign, which means getting sovereign peoples to function as sovereign.
Right.
You know, Sean, the real problem here is that we've been in this situation for quite a while. It's been since the 1960s, the power of the international banks has increased enormously. They control the governments. They control both parties in the United States. It's not government as an abstraction that's a problem. It's who's running the government. Now, what unfortunately a lot of these so-called conservatives believe is that it's just government, and if you get rid of government and put power back in the states, you'll solve the problem. The problem is the corruption of the American people to accept this idea that there's no solution. And so you ask me my view on this. I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't think we could win this fight. Now, the preponderance of power at the moment is on the other side because of the media control, the control of governments and so on. But they're operating from an empty deck. I mean, they've created the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. It's bigger than it was in 2008. They were shaken to the core by what happened in 2008. The American people responded initially, and then we went back to sleep and let the bailout process continue. Now, I can give you a couple of weak points that we could use to bring down this power. One of them is the revelations that have come out on Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. You know, our organization put out a book in 1978 called Dope Incorporated.
That's right.
In which we identified the Hong Kong Bank as at the center of British global operations using drug trafficking as a monetary policy and also to deaden the population.
This is HSBC Harley's talking about, guys, one of the most criminal banks on planet Earth. Go ahead, Harley.
It's a criminal enterprise. It's not even a bank anymore. Now, the thing about HSBC is that it's been caught laundering money. It's been caught laundering money for terrorists, for drug pushers, for allowing tax evaders to get out from under taxes. Not only that, but we've now caught the people who protected them. It's not just Eric Holder, but Loretta Lynch, who is the Obama appointee to be Attorney General, was the person who presided over the HSBC case on drug money laundering 3 or 4 years ago, in which they were let off with a deferred prosecutorial agreement that they would stop committing these crimes, and they paid $1.2 billion. They can't stop committing these crimes because that's what their bank is. But here's where you see the problem. Loretta Lynch, who came up working with Geithner on the Federal Reserve Board in New York, the New York Fed, who's a Wall Street lawyer, a flunky, who covered up by this deferred prosecutorial agreement for HSBC. They should have had their charter revoked. They should have been kicked out of the country and their leaders arrested for criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States. Instead, she protected it. Now, when her vote came up in the committee in the Senate, 3 Republicans voted with the Democrats to approve her, including Orrin Hatch, who prides himself as being a conservative. That's the problem we have. The willingness to go along with Wall Street in both parties has brought us to this precipice. Had the Congress, had the Senate, and it's still open that it's going to go before the full Senate, there's still an opportunity to derail her. If that opportunity is used to expose the crimes of Wall Street and the protection of those criminals by the Justice Department and Obama, you would have the basis for an impeachment of Obama and shutting down these criminal enterprises. So we still have the opportunity to do that. People just have to look into this story. You can go to the LarouchPAC website where we have the updated story on HSBC, which, by the way, is one of the banks that is involved in drug money laundering. Citibank does the same thing. So does Bank of America. But we have the opportunity to use this and get at the Achilles heel of the banking system, which is there's only 2 places they're getting liquidity from right now. The global banks like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, and secondly, from drug money. If you cut off the flow of drug money to these banks, and if we cut off the flow of funds from the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, these banks would be forced into a collapse. They would go into bankruptcy. That's also the lesson of what's happening with Greece. Why are they refusing to give the Greeks a way out from under an unpayable debt, which really is not Greek debt, it's bank debt? Why are they refusing when Greece is only 3% of the EU? Because they have to keep the money flowing. If there's a break by Greece, then Spain, which is 8% of the EU, and Italy, which is about 14% of the EU, will follow Greece's lead, and then the euro will collapse. And that means the London banks and the Wall Street banks. So they're desperate. So we have levers, but those levers have to be, we need hands on those levers and not wait for the Congress to do it. The American people have to insist that it happen.
Absolutely. And one of the things that comes to mind as we talk about HSBC and drug money laundering, Harley, is the war in Afghanistan. As our listeners are well aware, poppy production in Afghanistan was at an all-time low under the Taliban, and it has been at an all-time high under the occupation of the U.S. military. And one of the ways to stop the drug money flowing through these criminal banks would be to bring the troops home and get out of Afghanistan, but we're not going to see that happen either. I've come to the conclusion, Harley, that we are now suffering opium wars within our own shores as we see heroin use and heroin overdose and the influx of heroin into major metropolitan areas in the United States and the suburbs, for God's sakes, explode. It's absolutely criminal, and those of us paying attention know exactly what's going on and where the opium's coming from and why. I think we're under attack here. It's a multifaceted attack. They're after our liberties, they're after our freedom, they're after the internet, they're coming after our kids with drugs, they're putting us in prisons. We've got the largest prison population on planet Earth. I think our prison population is 3 times that of China, despite us being 1/3 the size of China in terms of population. There's so much to talk about here. Let's round out the conversation with Greece. You guys have some dynamite.
Let me, Sean, if I can, let me just say one thing on the opium question, because
Sure.
You're absolutely right. This is what our book, Dope Incorporated, showed, that it is a war against America, but it's also a war against Russia, a war against China. And there was very good cooperation in anti-drug policy between the United States and Russia 5-6 years ago. The Russians have a vested interest. The Iranians are suffering from drug trafficking, and they wanted to shut it down. The Indians were willing to work on this, as were the Chinese. We could have had a collaborative effort to shut down the drugs by destroying the poppy fields and stopping the money laundering. It was the United States and Britain that said that would be a violation of free trade. And so what you see is, under these abstract slogans, policies that are designed to destroy our nation. And I really think that the potential for collaboration with Russia on this was thrown out the window by Obama, and with collaboration from McCain and others. The military wants to collaborate with Russia on combating terrorism and combating drug trafficking, and their hands are now tied.
Well, it's astounding, Harley, and when you're paying attention and you know this stuff, and as you've just pointed out, Loretta Lynch's cover-up of HSBC crimes, her abetting them in their crimes, it then makes sense. We truly do have criminals in charge at the highest levels within the United States government, and I hate to say it, it's an absolute fact, and you've painted the picture beautifully here. Let's round out.
And that's why impeachment is a legitimate weapon, because when the Constitution is violated repeatedly, then go make the case. And for those cowardly Republicans who refuse to do that, I say to them, don't worry about the votes as it stands today. Make the case as publicly as possible on key issues, like Obama's support for international terrorism, the cover-up of drug money laundering by the major banks. Make that case, and there won't be anyone left in this country who would support Obama. it would be a sea change.
Yeah, I hear you, Harley, and I do. I know your heart's in the right place, as is mine, and I'm saying this on behalf of the listeners, because if they're feeling like I'm feeling, impeachment's not going to do anything to change the direction of this country, because as we started the interview by saying, they're just going to put in Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush. And now that we've circled back to that topic, I really would like to hear your opinion on that, because as I've tried to wake up friends and neighbors, even those who consider themselves conservatives, I've said, can you imagine a nation in which the former head of the CIA became president, and then his offspring became president, and now one of the brothers may become president, and in lieu of those people being in office, we get their puppets, the Clintons, that were running drugs in Arkansas and that are close to the Bush family. This is a cabal of criminals, and we've endured this now for decades. And to me, Harley, it appears that they want us to endure it for decades to come. This Bush Clinton cabal, this is an insane paradigm, Harley, that they're presenting Bush and Clinton in 2016 with a straight face.
Well, Sean, the only answer to that is that powerful forces in the past have collapsed, sometimes by their internal corruption, sometimes by an uprising of populations. The American Revolution was a small movement which mobilized to get rid of the British, even when it was less than 1/3 of the population that wanted to do that. So depending on leadership, this is the question. This is why I am so much attacking the leadership of the two parties and most of the people in the two parties, because they're corrupted. But the American people, by accepting it and saying there's no solution, are accepting a corruption which is destroying our own lives.
Right.
And so I'm going to beat the drum of citizens waking up until it either happens or until we're incinerated in nuclear war.
Yeah, no, you
And
should.
I think that,
you're right.
And I know, I read the posts, the responses when you post my interviews on YouTube, and there are a lot of cynics out there. Cynics who say, well, the Zionist lobby is too powerful. The bankers' lobby is too powerful. They're powerful, but they're destroying nations. And if the people of those nations could be inspired to rise up, if Obama were impeached by a mass popular movement, it would be very difficult for a replacement to be Bush or Hillary when they're part of the same system. And so, I think we have to get rid of the chains of submission. And that's not the American way. But because we've been submitting, we are no longer a superpower.
Yeah, and just to circle back, you mentioned dramatic falls of power that have happened in the past, sea changes and shifts, and Ceausescu in Romania comes to mind. I would love to see the people rise up and take their nation back.
And we should put Obama in a nice cell and let him watch basketball all the time where he won't hurt anybody.
Yeah, these people ought to be put in prison for sure. Harley, let's just round out the conversation. Let's circle back to Greece.
Yeah.
You guys have some dynamite material on how the Greeks technically owe nothing.
Well, the people of Greece rose up and elected a party to be in charge of the country that had been polling at 5% a year earlier. So when you talk about changes, what happened in Greece? Let me very quickly summarize it. In order for Greece to enter the Eurozone, they had to sell a certain amount of bonds to show that they had the financial wherewithal to accept the common currency. They hired Goldman Sachs. Goldman came in and marketed bonds. They sold those bonds to their clients. Then they shorted those bonds. They forced the Greek government to get swap and insurance. Basically, a swap is an insurance of an existing financial mechanism. This imposed a growing debt on the Greeks that the Greek economy could not sustain. Under those circumstances, the European Central Bank, the European Union, and the International Monetary Fund came in, and they said this debt must be paid first and foremost. And so in the last 4 years, there's been 267 billion euros of bailouts to the nation in the name of the nation of Greece. Less than 10% of that, by some accounts, only 3% of that was ever spent in Greece by the government. 90 to 95% of that went straight to the banks. But here's the catch. Because those bailouts were loans, the Greeks now owe that 267 billion plus interest on that, in addition to their other debt. So this is how the IMF and the global banks saddle nations with unpayable debts. And to collect the debt, They told the Greeks, you have to sell your railroads, your ports, you have to privatize your healthcare system. You can't spend any money to take care of people in Greece. And so Greece has over 25% real unemployment, over 60% youth unemployment. Their economy is contracted by 25%. Now, why would you allow such criminals who have done this to a country to be the one to dictate the terms for the future? And so the Greek people elected a government headed by a man named Tsipras. It's the Syriza party, which came in with 37% of the vote and formed an alliance with the independent Greeks. Now those two parties are at 80% in the polls because they're saying we're not going to pay this illegitimate debt. And the EU and Obama sent Jack Lew to lecture them, the Treasury Secretary, and he said, you have to play by the rules. And they said, we never agreed to these rules. So the pressure is on now. The Greeks got a 4-month extension. Now, some people say that was a capitulation by the Greeks. It wasn't. They said, we're not going to pay. We're not going to do a bailout. We're going to reorganize this thing over the next 4 months. So they bought some time. They kicked the can down the road. Meanwhile, the Germans under Schäuble, the finance minister, are basically saying, let the Greeks exit the euro. We can survive that. But they can't. And so that's why Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank and others are saying the Greeks must pay. They must adhere to these agreements, even though these agreements have destroyed the nation, have not reduced the debt. The Greek debt to GDP is 2 times higher than it was when this started. So this is an example of a cannibalizing system that will loot populations till they kill them in a form of fascism, which was called corporatism. You let the corporations, in this case the banks and the insurance companies, dictate the policies of a nation. And the current Greek government is saying, we're not going to let you do that. And the American people should be supporting the Greeks. But I refer to this Greek case because it shows that when people finally couldn't take it anymore, there was a leadership there which never gave up when they were only at 3 or 4% of the popular vote in the polls. They kept fighting until they became the government. Now, it's a long shot for them to win, but it's a long shot for our nation to survive. So let's take the long shot and stop whining and complaining and actually act on universal principles which are in our Constitution.
Yeah, within our Constitution and within our DNA. I mean, it's at the core of who we are. Our listeners are libertarian-minded, and I agree with you 100%, Harley. In fact, a reader reminded me over the weekend of a video I did about Ron Paul called Restoring Honor, and I watched it. I haven't seen it since 2012 when I put it out on YouTube, and it brought tears to my eyes last night. I was watching it. My children are in it holding signs, and I can't believe how fast time goes, Harley. It just flies by, and it's so sad when we know what they did. They stole the election from Ron Paul, and my friend Mike Krieger over at Liberty Blitzkrieg just wrote a piece over the weekend about disappearing Rand Paul, how the media is disappearing Rand Paul as though he is inconsequential, as though he didn't get the top vote at both of the most recent CPAC straw polls. He is the front-runner candidate. They're giving us Jeb Bush. I have to ask your opinion on Rand Paul before I let you go. Rand Paul 2016, does he resonate with you?
Well, I think what he did at the CPAC conference is an example of leadership. He stood up there and said, we have no reason to be in Syria. We should not arm the Syrians, and we have no reason to be in Ukraine. And he's right. And he's also right about the bailouts. I'd like to see him get behind Glass-Steagall. I'd like to see him recognize that there is a higher purpose to government, provided it's under the people. Because I think a lot of libertarians are beginning to realize that having the government, I mean, it's obvious, having the government under the control of criminals like the too big to fail banks does restrict freedom. In fact, makes a mockery of the idea that we're a free nation. But they're not yet sold on the idea that we can have institutions of self-government which can prevent these kinds of crimes. And that's not giving too much power to the government. That's the people using the government to enhance our freedom, including our economic freedom. And so I'd like people to take a look at what Lyndon LaRouche has written on what the solution is, starting with Glass-Steagall. That's a regulation, but it's a regulation to stop criminal bankers. What his proposal is for a credit system, a Hamiltonian credit system that funds infrastructure, but doesn't have government running the businesses. It makes the seed capital available to bring about jobs, creating new wealth. And to me, that's what the American system is about. And I think a lot of what Rand Paul is doing in bringing up his opposition to these utopian military policies of the administration and of the Bush administration before it is really important. And I support what he's doing with that. I just like to see him reflect more on this question of how you use the government effectively to stop this kind of criminal activity.
Yeah, I hear you. And, well, you know what? Bottom line is he's a hell of a lot better human being than Jeb Bush and the Bush cabal, and he's a lot better person than Hillary Clinton.
We have to stop Jeb Bush. I mean, Jeb Bush is, he was one of the initiators of PNAC, the Project for a New American Century.
Right.
So the idea that he's different from his brother, you know, he's different from his brother in no important, significant way.
Well, I mean, anybody that would believe he's a maverick and he's cut from a different cloth than the family he represents it's lunacy. That's nothing more than Mockingbird mainstream talking points. And if you guys want the real news, if you want real perspective on what's happening in the world, check out LarouchPAC.com. Top article right here. I'm looking at Harley. LaRouche says the murder of Russian opposition leader Nemtsov smells like Newland. You're not going to find information like that, guys, from the Mockingbird mainstream media. Our guest has been Harley Schlanger, the national spokesperson for LarouchPAC, and a terrific friend to SGT Report and a wonderful friend to Liberty. Harley, thanks so much for spending time with us today.
My pleasure, Sean. We'll talk to you soon.
We'll talk to you again soon. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. We very much appreciate you sharing this information with friends and family. It's our last chance. We either wake people up or we lose our nation permanently. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.